Professor Catherine Hayes, Specialist in Public Health Medicine, Public Health and Primary Care from Trinity College Dublin, is going to deliver a presentation now introducing us all to implementation science and the theoretical framework.
You're very welcome, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to hopefully inform you about implementation science, but certainly what I would like are plenty of questions, clarifications. We can possibly get through a road trip through implementation science, in just over a half an hour. So it will be just, I suppose, an overview in terms of the kind of things that I think it might be helpful for you to know. I would just like to acknowledge my colleagues at the Centre for Effective Services, particularly Katie Burke. The Centre for Effective Services is an NGO that's tasked with driving implementation throughout Ireland, and very helpful if you want to look at their website. My colleague at TCD, Professor Joe Barry, and my colleagues at the National Cancer Institute, where I did my training in implementation science. Okay, so really, I say what I want to do really is to provide you with an overview of some of the different implementation theories, frameworks, models, and core concepts in implementation science, and give you a sense really of their usability, when they would be used and what kind of strengths and weaknesses they have. Okay. So you heard already from Mary, what is implementation science or implementation research? And we consider it the creation and the application of knowledge to improve the implementation of health policies, programs and practices by systematic integration of research evidence. We all hear this bandied about getting research into practice, and this is about trying to do that in a systematic way so that we can improve our policies, our programs and our practice. And you might want to think about that in terms of your particular programs, whether it's a home care program, etc. So, to start thinking about what this means to you. So it seeks to understand how to systematically facilitate utilization of evidence, okay? Uses many disciplines and methods, so definitely not confined to one discipline. It emphasises partnerships between communities, implementers, researchers and policymakers. So that stakeholder engagement, that wide stakeholder engagement is of critical importance. So it provides a set of approaches or methods to bridge the gap between research and practice, to accelerate the development and delivery of services that improve and sustain health and well-being, health outcomes, and reduce health inequalities. So that is disparities that we come across all the time, whereby, for example, people with private healthcare can access services more easily than those without private healthcare. So it allows us to kind of tease out these concepts a little bit more fully to try and bridge that gap and create a fairer society for everybody. Okay, we'll move on, Mary. We'll take the next slide.
And just 1 second, Catherine, sorry.
No worries. Great. And this looks a little bit complicated, but it's really this publication pathway. From the time of conducting some original research, it is estimated that it takes maybe up to 17 years to get this into practice, because by the time you've done your original research, and for example, the research that I do is all on prevention, and one of the programs that I'm involved in is a Stop Smoking program, which is for women in disadvantaged areas. And that program, we would hope that it would get into practice quite quickly, but we know that from the original research that we're just doing at the moment to submitting it to a journal, that will take another half a year to get it accepted. From acceptance to publication will be another quarter of a year. By the time it gets into PubMed or any of those databases, it'll be much longer again. By the time it gets into reviews, systematic reviews or guidelines or textbooks or whatever, it takes, you know, another maybe 10 years beyond that again. So, as I said, it can take a really long time to get research into practice. And what implementation science tries to do is to try to accelerate that process. Okay? So it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research to the benefit of patient care. So that's pretty horrendous. So we really do need to try and step up that process and accelerate it so that it can be turned into benefit for patients. So this is just, as you can see, a slide, and that's from the National Institutes of Health. And it's basically a runway with nothing on it. And so we can't just assume that if you build a runway that, you know, immediately planes are going to come in. We have to do something to actually accelerate that process or make it happen. So implementation science is very much about the science of making things happen. Okay? So what are these implementation frameworks that we talk about? So they're basically just methods to categorize these concepts of implementation in a logical way. Okay? They differ in terms of what are the assumptions they make about a particular project. Okay? The aims of the framework can be different. The context, whether it's policy, whether it's practice, whether it's research. The sectors, whether it's palliative care, your discipline, whether it's public health, my discipline, mental health, child welfare, etc. So what these frameworks try to do is they try to pull all of this together and categorize these concepts just to give them a kind of a logical framework. Okay. And why would we use them? It's to give an overview of the practices which guide the implementation process, no matter what sector it's in. It allows us to describe the specific steps in the planning, and you heard about planning earlier, and in the execution, which is the implementation, and highlights the pitfalls to be avoided. Okay? Now, researchers and practitioners often have difficulties in choosing an appropriate framework, and you'll see why in a minute. Okay? There are lots of them. Okay? You may have heard of some of them, but there are about maybe up to 100 frameworks at this particular time. So it is difficult to say which of these is going to work best for me. Okay, we move on. Okay, so how do we, untangle all this mess then of all these frameworks, which are supposed to be about giving us a logic to actually doing our work so we can accelerate it into practice? Well, the theoretical approaches or the frameworks or theories or whatever, they have three overarching aims. The first one is to describe or guide the process of translating research into practice. So how do you do it? And they are process models. Okay? The next group are about understanding and explaining what influences implementation outcomes. What are the barriers to getting your research into practice or to getting it implemented? What are the barriers to showing that it's effective? And so these are these determinant frameworks, and we'll talk some more about those. We also have some very classic theories around that. And also we have specific aspects of implementation that are addressed in implementation theories. Okay? And evaluation frameworks then. And they are basically evaluating the implementation of what we do. So we go into a bit more detail, and we'll give you some examples of these. So this guy, Per Nielsen, and he's very widely quoted. He's based in Sweden. He was our external examiner in Trinity in implementation science for 3 years. So he has done this categorization of the implementation frameworks. And if you just Google him, his article will come up very readily. I will give you some resources anyway at the end. So basically, the process models, that's the how-to in terms of the research into practice. The next group then are the ones that allow you to explain and understand, okay? So your determinant frameworks, they specify your barriers and enablers that influence your implementation outcomes, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. They're your classic theories then from external fields like psychology, sociology, and organizational theory. Okay. And I mentioned implementation theories, providing an understanding of aspects of implementation. And the evaluation frameworks then, they specify what aspects of implementation that you can evaluate. And, for example, say in my work, I would be evaluating smoking cessation programs, stop smoking programs, and the type of evaluation that I am doing is a randomized controlled trial. Okay. All right, so giving you just some examples of these, the how-to or the process models. An example of one is called the Quality Implementation Framework, a synthesis of critical steps in the implementation process, and that comes from the US. And as I said, it addresses the steps in the implementation process. One which you may have heard before or may not is the Knowledge to Action Framework, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. I've selected one or two from each of these groups so that you can get a little bit of a flavour of what I'm talking about. The determinant frameworks then, I've selected two here, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research and the Paris framework, which is often used in a clinical setting. Classic theories then, a classic example here is the diffusion of innovation theory, and that's very old. I mean, it dates, I think, from the 1950s. And this is where, if you do something, create an innovation, well, then it will gradually diffuse out. And, it can well take up to 17 years in that instance for it to get into practice. But you will always have, for example, the early adopters who adopted early, and they take on board your innovation early. And then it works down through various groups and eventually to the laggards. And the laggards are the ones, the naysayers who are the least willing to adopt innovation. So if you allow this diffusion, which is a passive process, okay, as proposed to an active, as compared to an active dissemination, well then a diffusion is a much more passive process. But it does explain how things happen, and you get an understanding of how things happen, particularly if you don't intervene to accelerate that process, which is what we're doing in implementation science and implementation research. So again, you might have heard of the implementation theories that deal with specific aspects of implementation, and such examples are the behaviour change wheel by Susan Mickey from University College London, and again she is very widely written and lots of material there. Another one then, and I see the misspelling there, is the normalisation process theory. This is not for the faint-hearted. This is from Carl May, who's in Southampton. But this is very useful in terms of scaling up your innovations or your programs so that they become more widespread and then they're sustainable. And Mary mentioned about sustainability earlier. And then the evaluation frameworks, again, I don't know if you've heard about any of these, but the REAIM, again, is a very, very well utilised one, particularly in public health interventions, for example, like vaccination. And I'll talk to you a bit more about that as well. Okay, we'll move on. So I say there's about more than 90 frameworks exist, and the terms theory, model and framework, they're often used interchangeably in implementation science. So I say don't worry about, trying to distinguish between theories and models and frameworks. Essentially there's kind of minute differences that you needn't be worried about in relation to those. Okay. So this lady, Rachel Tabak, who's basically in the US, she produced this paper, and it's quite old now, because at the time there were only 61 frameworks, but she reviewed all 61. And she said the basis of her paper was how to make better use of these models and frameworks. And she says, well, you know, context is critical. And whatever context that you are in, you know, that's a really good place to start in terms of, you know, what type of framework you're going to choose. Focus on external validity. And now that sounds a little bit jargonized, but what that means is basically, you know, use something that's tried and tested, okay, that has been used, because then it's much more likely to stand up to scrutiny. Begin with the stakeholders, and I mentioned the stakeholders earlier, and that's everybody from your community to your practitioners to your policy makers, whoever is relevant, obviously your patient, so take their perspective, okay? Now, the next piece is important. You need to balance between fidelity to your intervention or program or policy and how it's adapted to your local setting. Now, fidelity is an important core concept in implementation science, and really what this is does it do what you intended to do, okay? For example, if you're delivering, as I am, well, I'm not directly delivering, but my research is around delivery of a 12-week program delivered by trained lay women, okay, to women in disadvantaged communities who smoke. And basically, they deliver a 12-week program. And we have to make sure, you know, that the 12-week program is delivered as it was supposed to be delivered, okay? So that, you know, that all of the aspects that are meant to be covered in the 12-week program are delivered. And we can only really do that by recording or by observing, okay, or we can ask them, the facilitators themselves to complete a checklist, or we can ask the women who received the program for their assessment on whether it was delivered. But we need to get some clear and, if possible, objective measure in terms of whether the intervention or the program was delivered as it was intended. Okay. Now, if we were delivering this program, which we are in Ireland, and we're delivering it in Hungary, which we hope to do, we would have to adapt the program to the local setting, because there would be cultural differences. There would be very different contextual differences, for example, in terms of the way that the standard healthcare services are delivered, in terms of maybe how the local women engage you know, with programs. So you would need to adapt it to the local setting, but without compromising the actual fidelity or the core components of the intervention. Okay, so that's a really important concept. But, you know, I say you're unlikely to need to create a new model, you know, if you're choosing implementation framework or frameworks, okay? But they are the kind of factors that you need to consider. And this is just basically, I think you should be more specific here in step 2, you know, in terms of your program, but, you know, then a miracle occurs and it all hangs together. So as I said, there are steps to follow, but you need to bring into account all your local context, which will provide you with the miracle. Okay. So basically, there are many common factors across the different frameworks and models. So they can be used across your different settings, many common factors. So how they're labeled or categorized is not really so important. Okay. So we'll move on now, and just to say, picked out a few, and one process framework, because it's easily understandable, is the knowledge to action. This came from Canada by Graham in 2006. Okay, we'll move on. Thank you. And this looks maybe a little bit confusing, but if you move in there, okay, there are 2 parts to this framework. Okay, the first one is this circular piece here, the knowledge creation, okay, and then the other piece then is the action cycle. That's the wider circle, okay. So the knowledge creation here is about generating the knowledge. Okay, this is about looking at your literature and all of that, synthesizing it, putting it all together in your reviews, etc., and producing your product. Okay, so this is where you create your knowledge. Okay, and you may create or develop your program or whatever. Okay, so here you have now the action cycle then is what problem are you trying to address? Say the problem that I'm addressing is the problem of smoking. Okay, and so I select the knowledge that's there already, okay, in my cycle. I adapt it to the local context. My local context is disadvantaged women. Okay, I assess the barriers to why knowledge isn't being used. Okay, I select, or we say tailor or implement your programs accordingly. That's what we have done in our program. Then we have to monitor, okay, how it's being used. We have to evaluate the outcomes. Has it been effective? Okay, has this worked? Okay, and then how do we work to sustain it? How do we keep it going? How do we integrate it into the standard health service? All of those queries and questions. So then you're back again to identifying that kind of a problem, and you're basically off again. So that's the knowledge to action framework, and that's a very commonly used knowledge translation framework. And you will hear about you know, KT and implementation science, sometimes used interchangeably. KT, very common in Canada, implementation science, more common in the US and in these parts as well. Okay, so then we're going on to the explanatory frameworks, and I'm going to mention two here. One is the consolidated framework for implementation research. Okay, we can move on. And this was developed by a psychiatrist, Laura Damschreuder, and again, it's very, very widely used. And what it does, I mean, don't worry about this language. It basically takes these key constructs, or if you like, theory components from many published implementation models and frameworks, and puts them all into a single framework. So it's what's called a meta theory. Okay, and she has synthesized 19 implementation models and found these 39 different theoretical pieces grouped into 5 categories. So the domains are basically categories, and it provides a consistent, say, categorization, you know, of terms and language and definitions. And I said that's what these frameworks are about. They're about giving you a systematic, logical grouping in order to accelerate research into practice. Okay, we'll move forward. So yes, I think I'll take the next slides. So she categorized these, say, 39 theory pieces into 5 different categories. And this is a little bit confusing, and I know that they're in the process of actually revising this, this map, but basically there are 5 bits. Here are the individuals, and when I think of my, you know, of my research, these are the women that are part in our program. Okay, the intervention is what we're doing, our smoking cessation, our 12-week program. Okay, and it has these core components which are basically in our program. They are behavioral counselling and using NRT. Okay, and this is when it starts off. This is when the intervention starts here. But as the women, you know, go through the intervention, we come out the other end. Our core components remain the very same, but our adaptive periphery might change. So the shape of this, the adaptations to the context that I mentioned earlier, this might change a little bit with time as the women go through the program, as they go through the whole process here. And the process, they are the steps. Okay. Now we have things here like the inner setting. Now our program is delivered in local communities, so we would regard that, you know, as the inner setting. The outer setting then would be, say, external factors. It would be, say, the HSE, the wider smoking cessation service, which would be delivered by the HSE. It would be tobacco control policies, okay. It would be, things even like the economic climate, that's there at the moment. Is stopping smoking a concern, for disadvantaged women at the moment? Perhaps not. So they're all the kind of outer setting factors. So that just kind of explains the 5 different domains or categories that she talks about. I'm just watching the time there. Okay, right, we'll move on. Now, I don't think I need to go into this actually. These are all the things that you cover with the intervention characteristics. So that's your program. Was it developed internally or by another agency, etc. How much did it cost? The relative perception amongst your stakeholders, among your patients, among your health providers, that it has more advantage than an alternative. So, for example, they're the kind of things that you would think about when you're delivering, for example, maybe your home care program, okay, or a particularly new innovation in relation to home care, something like that. You will know this much better than me. Okay, we'll move on to the next one, as I'm not going to. I did mention the outer setting, which is the economic, political, and the cultural context within which an organisation resides, or within which your program is being delivered. So they're all of the things that that need to be taken into account. Okay, move on, and then the say inner setting then. The age and size of an organisation. Okay, so that's it says your structure, political, and cultural context through which an implementation process will proceed. And as I've said, we deliver our intervention or our program in the community, in the local community. So that's our kind of cultural context. And culture is really important. Your organizational norms and values. Okay, I'll skip over the rest of that. I don't think it's necessary to go into it. So then, okay, the characteristics of the individuals, and I mentioned I gave the example of our patients, but it may also refer to a team or unit. Okay, so it doesn't have to be the individuals who are receiving the program. Okay. But the knowledge and beliefs about whether the program or intervention works is particularly important. The self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is about your belief in your own ability, okay, to implement the innovation. And self-efficacy is really important in any kind of behaviour change. For example, if I was a smoker and I wanted to give up, I'd have to believe that I can do this. I'd have to believe, I'd have to have the confidence in my own ability, to do this. So a very, very important component of all behaviour change interventions, okay? The individual stage of change, of course, is very important. The phase that a person is in as you progress towards enthusiastic and sustained use of the intervention. So basically they are the kind of characteristics on an individual basis that you would need to assess. Because that gives you the real sense of the barriers and the obstacles, as we mentioned earlier, and the enablers, that will help if you're delivering, a program or a policy or a practice. Okay, we'll go to the next one. And then the process, basically, that's the how-to. And we mentioned, there are really, I suppose, kind of 4 stages here. The planning, okay, we mentioned earlier. The stakeholder engagement, key. So getting all of your opinion leaders. If you have a champion, really important, somebody who really takes this on and is happy to go to run with it. You need to have your leaders inside, outside, and support or influence from external agencies. For example, in our program, we have really good support from HSE, and we need to have that, or we couldn't sustain our program. Okay, and the execution then, that's just carrying it out according to plan and reflecting and evaluating. Okay. So the elements of successful implementations where scientific evidence is viewed as sound and fitting with professional and patient beliefs. The context is receptive to implementation in terms of supportive leadership, culture and evaluation systems, and there's an appropriate mechanisms in place to facilitate implementation. Okay. So, well, really just to say very widely cited and used, and you can have a look at that website if you're interested, it can be difficult enough because there's a lot of coding, but it is very widely used and there's a lot of really useful information on it. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. I took this one, Paris, because this was developed in a clinical setting. It was developed by a nurse, Jo Roycroft Malone, who also works in Bangor University, and it's really gained a lot of traction and very useful in a clinical context, so I thought you might be interested in this. Okay, move on. So in hers, there are 3 elements to successful implementation. There's robust evidence, receptive context, and facilitation of change. And we'll talk about these, and these elements, you know, they have this dynamic relationship between each other. And again, like the previous one, each element has different sub-elements. And each of the elements or sub-elements is on a continuum from high to low. And I'll just show you that in the diagram, which makes much more sense. Okay, so this is it. These are her big elements here. Your evidence, which comes from your research, your clinical experience, a patient experience, and any information on local context that you might have. Your facilitation then, okay, so that, you know, your skills, you have the skills to make this happen. Are they appropriate? What is, you know, the role, the facilitation role, its purpose, etc. And then the context, again, your culture, leadership, is there a climate for evaluation and audit, etc. So basically, what she says is that successful implementation is a function of evidence, facilitation, and context. Okay, so we move on. And another even more complicated diagram, but basically this is just here your F1, okay, F2 and F3, these are the 3 parameters. So if you've got strong evidence, okay, you've got a good situation for implementation into practice. If you've got strong context, okay, so if context is over here, good evidence, and facilitation is up here, this is the ideal situation for implementation of evidence into practice. So if you don't have one of these, you won't get as good implementation. I mean, that's really what it's saying. Okay, so up here on this right, ideal. Okay, I'll take the next one. So in terms of the evidence, that's just the sub-elements then. I mean, our randomized controlled trials or guidelines are the best research evidence. Clinical experience, where you have a consensus, obviously that's best. Where you have partnership with patients. So this is where you get your, you know, best evidence, and then there might be important local information that you have to take into account as well. Okay? So the context sub-elements then, if you have a learning organization that's patient-centered, you know, like you have, I mean, that obviously helps implementation. Good leadership with effective organization and clear roles, okay, and routine audit and feedback, so constantly evaluating what we're doing, okay. And then the facilitation, obviously, if you have high respect, credibility, empathy, okay, clear role, okay, and a flexible, consistent style. I mean, they're good facilitatory components. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about Paris. Very quickly, because I think we're getting very near time. I'll just mention briefly REAIM, because this is, say, a very useful evaluation framework used widespread in public health. I just have a single diagram on it here. There are 5 elements of the REAIM framework. I like to think of this in terms of public health interventions like vaccination. you know, for example, if we were lucky enough to have a vaccine against COVID-19 in the near future, the things we'd have to consider are the reach. How do I reach the targeted population? Okay, so when we're evaluating it, how many people did I reach? Okay, what was your coverage like as a proportion of the total population who needed it? How do I know my intervention is effective? Well, have I got a massively reduced rate of COVID-19 compared to what would have happened in the absence of a vaccine? Okay. Adoption then is how do I develop organizational support to deliver my intervention? I mean, do I do it through general practice? Do I do it through health clinics? If I do it, you know, in either or any of these settings, what's the adoption or the take-up rate like in the settings as a proportion, you know, of all of the settings? So, so that's my organizational support. So then the implementations, how do I ensure that it's delivered properly? Okay, have I got trained staff? You know, have I got, you know, appropriate venues, etc. You know, measures to collect any adverse effects, all of that. And then how do I incorporate the intervention so it's delivered over the long term? So that's not just one hit, you know, wonder, so that it's sustained and becomes there for, you know, as long as it's needed. So that's basically a re-aim.
I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Mark Pearson, Senior Lecturer in Implementation Science and Knowledge Mobilisation, Wolfson Palliative Care Research Centre, Hull York Medical School.
Okay, let's get started. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today and to run this workshop. I think the title for this, I sort of struggled over the title for this a bit. It's a bit awkward, this title, Conscious Implementation. I was just trying to, really something that Catherine mentioned earlier on as well, which is that implementation too often is unplanned, is not reflected upon, is not sufficiently researched. And so the aim of this workshop really is to start helping you to think about how you can be, how you can more proactively do research that incorporates implementation considerations and which ultimately will improve the implementation that is done. By the end of this, you'll be able to not worry about some of the frameworks and theories, but just to take a basic, getting your teeth stuck into the challenges kind of approach. But then I do also want to introduce one of the theories that Catherine was talking about earlier, which is normalisation process theory, and to give you a chance, an opportunity to practice using that to think about implementation challenges and how to take forward research that will address those challenges. And third, so thank you very much to the people who submitted the elevator pitches. We're going to sort of work through, have a chance to work through those and to think about how those could be developed, how they could be developed further in the light of, you know, what we've learned in this workshop this morning. I think Marie has very clearly set out how the breakouts are going to work, so I'm not going to spend any more time on that overview slide. I have just got a few slides here just to give my particular take on implementation science, some of which I know Catherine has really gone through now, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, but if you just give me, bear with me for a couple of minutes, I think there are a few fundamental points that it is worth addressing. So the first is the big question that we keep referring to is, you know, why is it important to research implementation? Well, there's the moral reason, which is basically that people have the right to, people who are using services have the right to high quality evidence-based health and social care. There's a significant ethical issue really around conducting research that then sits on a shelf and is never used in practice. So that's what I think gets you out of bed in the morning, whether you're a clinician or a researcher, is the desire to improve the health and social care outcomes. there are also practical reasons as well related to implementation. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase that it's no good locking the stable door after the horse has bolted. And this is very, very true for implementation science. Implementation is arguably integral to interventions, and so leaving it until the end of a research project or before, just immediately before it is time to implement an intervention is too late. It needs to be considered in tandem with intervention development and testing. And the third reason, if you're a researcher or if you have any interest in research, is a more strategic reason. So this is the MRC complex interventions guidance. This was the draft that was issued for consultation last year, and this still is not published, but there are significant developments from the earlier, more linear approach to developing and evaluating interventions that was from the 2008 guidance. So you'll notice here that rather than a stepwise process, there's a far more iterative process of developing interventions, feasibility studies, evaluation and implementation. And this is all placed within an explicit understanding of what works for whom, in what circumstances and why within complex systems. And you'll notice also that that context is very clearly flagged throughout that process. And I mentioned, and there's a process of iterative development and tailoring that are recognised at all of these phases of development, feasibility, evaluation, and implementation. So it's also explicitly recognised as well that implementation and issues such as economics, for example, need to be considered from the start of the process of developing and evaluating complex interventions. It's not the bits that you do at the end. There are, of course, many other categories as well that there may be that implementation may come under, whether that be e-health, whether it be screening or surveillance tools, tools to support shared decision making, for example, or the change in professional roles, or indeed the implementation of guidelines. And of course, these are not all mutually exclusive. I'll just present those there to give you an initial thought about how you might classify the particular implementation, the type of change that you're seeking to implement. Well, how would you interpret this cartoon? I've mentioned already that that implementation is arguably integral to intervention design, and focusing on one, for example, technical element. So the technical design of a television is almost, in some senses, is meaningless if you have nothing to show or no reason to watch that television. And I think sometimes that's the state that we find ourselves in with regards to implementation. So let's think a little bit about taking a staged approach to implementation. So I think Marie, in some senses, flagged this in her initial presentation earlier on, and I don't want to. I think it's important, really, actually, that we get to the breakout sessions, so you get a chance to practice applying and thinking about implementation challenges. So, but all I just wanted to put here is that I want in some ways to demystify implementation, and in many ways the principles of thinking about implementation are the same that you would apply often in clinical practice or any form of research, and that is basically what do we start with? We assess what are the challenges. We need to know what we're dealing with before we try to address what the challenges are. Second, we then want to identify what the evidence and local knowledge is about those challenges so that those challenges can be effectively addressed. And we want to bring that knowledge together in a way that produces a meaningful implementation strategy. And it's here that we can sort of think about, explicitly how each aspect of that strategy addresses each of the particular implementation challenges. And then, of course, as well, we have to monitor over time. As Catherine highlighted, the implementation of any intervention is a dynamic process. It's not a one-off state, and it's important that modifications or tailoring, however we want to, whatever term we want to use, it takes place continuously, because the world around the world in which you are implementing changes, and unless you have some way of monitoring the impact or not of what you're doing, you won't know whether you need to refine or change or tailor the approach that you're taking. Okay, so as Catherine mentioned earlier on, the normalisation process theory is a theory that can be used, I would argue, in a number of different ways. It's a theory that's really been derived from a number of social and socio-psychological theories, and in many ways it predates, a lot of the theory that it draws on predates the explicit use of the term implementation and the growth of the field implementation science, but it is arguably a highly relevant and well worked up theory that is relevant for the field. So just reflecting as well on what Catherine said earlier on about choosing and using frameworks and theories, I think a key thing to keep in mind whenever you're using a framework or theory is that it's there for you to judiciously use it. You shouldn't let the theory or the framework start using you. They all have strengths and weaknesses. It's there as a tool to help you to either structure a problem or to structure research into investigating that problem. And it can, something such as normalisation process theory can perhaps help you to take a little bit more of a step back to understand the interrelationship between different implementation challenges. So anyway, that's a long introduction to NPT. So what is it? Well, it's a theory that explains the relationship between what people do, the context that they're in, and the extent to which interventions are normalised or implemented into routine practice. Taking a very sociological approach, you could say that it expresses the interaction between agency, that is what people do or what they can do, and what the structural aspects are, whether these be social or whether these be social cognitive. These enable or constrain the agency that people have. So an implementation challenge could be mostly about process, where people's agency is key, or it could be primarily about structure, what it is that about the context that enables or constrains people's activities, or of course it can be about both. And the theory can be applied to both planning, or assessing, planning and evaluating implementation. So there are 4 aspects of normalisation process theory that we'll be thinking about here. They're listed in those boxes on the left. First of these is coherence. So this is the understanding that individuals and groups have about an intervention. And because this is a sociological theory, it points you towards thinking about the meaning that people give to those interventions. So for example, a change in how service is delivered for a manager maybe an efficiency or an effectiveness issue, but for frontline staff it may be experienced as a challenge to their professional role or to their workplace security. So it's important to have that focus on an understanding of how meaning can be different for different groups of people. Second dimension is cognitive participation. And this is what people do to engage in, legitimize and build a community around the use of an intervention. And this is one area where it can be useful to think of different professional cultures. So outside of palliative care, you know, a classic differences between the midwifery profession and the medical profession in how childbirth is conceptualized and treated. Yeah, at the risk of caricaturing, you know, but there are different professional cultures around that. And third, collective actions. These are the skills and the resources within an organisation that help explain whether or not people can engage and involve others in working towards a common goal. And then fourth is reflexive monitoring. So this is what we referred to earlier as well, about how people assess impact and how they perhaps use routine data, for example, to make work visible and to monitor the impact of that work and for it to be valued within an organisation. I mean, Mary, you mentioned about just acknowledging some of those issues with the frameworks and theories, in particular around language and how that does or does not enable the involvement of a broad group of stakeholders. And I think we just have to, at this point, we just have to acknowledge that that's a challenge, and that, you know, that using breaking these, I think all of these frameworks and theories have much to offer, but if we are genuine about wanting to be participatory in how we go about designing and conducting research, then we need to think very carefully about the language that we use. So to be honest, that's I think I'll keep my summary at that. Oops, let's go that. Thank you all very much for your time and for your energy and participation in the breakouts. Just a quick acknowledgement there to my colleagues on the Resolve project at Hull York Medical School and at the University of Leeds. I do have some references as well if you wish to follow those up. Thank you very much, everybody.